Thank you so much for joining us tonight, both in person and virtually. I'm Priya Bathija, and among other things, I am Vice President of Professional Development for the South Asian Bar Association of North America. 2 years ago, SABA created this role so that we could increase the professional development opportunities that we offered to our members across North America, regardless of their level of practice within the law. So we've done another number of things, including creating a leadership development program, creating opportunities for SABA attorneys to learn, such as in environments like this. We've also created access to resources on wellness, and we have created opportunities for SABA members to volunteer and give back to their community. So this event on inclusive sponsorship is one of the opportunities that we are offering through our professional development program. And before I introduce our speakers, I would like to thank Kirkland and Ellis for hosting us for this event as part of their commitment to improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in the legal community and as a champion of SABA. I'd also like to thank the bar associations that help partner on this event. That includes the South Asian Bar Association of Chicago, the Asian American Bar Association of Chicago, the Hispanic Lawyers Association of Illinois, the Black Women's Law Association of Chicago, and the Muslim Bar Association of Chicago. Before we get started, I have a couple housekeeping items. First, we do have a prayer room on site if anyone needs to break fast. It is right by the elevator, so if you need that and can't find it, please let us know. Also, we will be taking Q&A towards the end of the panel discussion. So if you are on the Zoom and have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. If you are live, we will take your questions live when we get to that point. And I know our speakers are planning to engage the audience in the room, in person, throughout the discussion. So we're gonna have a fireside chat between our speakers, and then, like I mentioned, Q&A. So pretty simple setup for the evening. We hope to be done by 6:45, and then we have a wonderful reception out in the foyer. So to incentivize you to engage in the room again, not on the Zoom, sorry, we have a few copies of the book that we're gonna be discussing today. So I will make the decision of who is the most engaged in the conversation, and the 3 top people will get free copies of the book, which Jamie has also signed. So now, to our speakers. Many of you already know Tara Raghavan. She is the current president of SABA North America. She is also a partner at Rakazi, Molino, Mazzacco, and Siwick, LLP. No? Nah. And our guest speaker tonight is Jamie Tynan. Jamie is an award-winning strategist, culture leader, and wellness champion known for her values of empathy and kindness in the workplace. She currently serves as a principal in the Healthcare Services Division at Korn Ferry. She is also the author of Inclusive Sponsorship, A Bold Vision to Advance Women of Color in the Workplace. As you'll soon hear, her thesis is that the lack of diverse representation in leadership roles is due to a lack of active sponsorship for underrepresented groups. And as she says, it's not a pipeline issue, it's a sponsorship issue. So Tara and Jamie, take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming and joining us here today. Really look forward to a robust discussion with the wonderful and incredible Jamie Tynan today. Just so everyone knows, we're going to cover a number of topics that are from the book. But to ensure that it remains interactive, I may ask some questions here and there of all of you. Hopefully in the Zoom function, Priya can manage that and we can get some questions that way too. So Jamie, let's get started. Can you give us a little bit about the backstory behind how you became an advocate for inclusive sponsorship and how you came to write the book?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest questions I get, and why focus on inclusive sponsorship. And when I think about my career, and I, maybe not so atypical from a lot of people, had a very nonlinear career. I did not know what I wanted to do when I graduated from college. And I decided to take a whole bunch of different paths. I had mentors in my career that gave me guidance and coaching, and that was super helpful. And then I got to a point in my career where I felt like I wasn't advancing in the way that I wanted to. But I was seeing a lot of my peers that seemed to just immediately have opportunities and get promoted. And I was always wondering what they were doing that was different. Clearly, it was something that I hadn't learned about. And I had started my career in healthcare leadership and had joined a regional healthcare system in Charlotte. And it was the first time where I actually had what I would consider to be a sponsor. So, someone who had identified me, had noticed that I was talented, that was influential, powerful enough to open up doors and gave me my first executive role and really advocated for me with senior leadership and with the CEO to give me opportunities. And I remember what that felt like. It felt very different than mentorship. It felt very, it was almost like someone was guiding me, giving me wind beneath my wings for my career. And it really inspired me to do the same. And I wondered how many women of color had that experience. And when I was talking to a lot of my peers, no one knew what sponsorship was. They were always talking about mentorship or finding mentors. And it really sparked in me wanting to share my experience so others can learn from it, but also to talk about and really almost democratize sponsorship as a way to advance, particularly for women of color, because I feel, and I talk about this in the book, that women of color tend to be over mentored and under sponsored. So that's how the book really came about. And I will tell you that writing a book, first of all, is quite an experience. And it was very therapeutic for me, but it was also a great reflection on why I felt sponsorship was such a important part of someone's professional development. So, yeah.
Jamie, you mentioned that you believe that women of color are over mentored and under sponsored.
Mm.
Before we get to that concept, can you talk a little bit about how you define mentorship?
Yeah.
And how you define sponsorship and how these two constructs differ?
Yep. Well, first, I want to say that both mentorship and sponsorship are absolutely critical. You need both. In fact, mentorship is usually the first step before you even get to sponsorship. But how I think about the difference is that mentorship is really about getting advice. It's really having that safe space. Let's say you're starting a new job or starting a new role in a different company, and you're looking for someone to help you navigate the unwritten rules of that company, or you're stepping up into your first executive role and you're trying to figure out how to do that successfully. And you find a mentor who's obviously lived that, can give you some pearls of wisdom, and their whole purpose is to really help and guide you. It's a very low risk proposition, right? Because the person is really just imparting wisdom and sharing their experience so that you can learn from that. And there's real, value in mentoring. And, when I think about my career, I've had some really important mentors in my career that helped to steer me. Sponsorship, on the other hand, is really about advocacy. So it takes the relationship one step further and it allows someone to use their political capital, their influence, their ability to, get into their network and help you succeed by opening doors, by maybe introducing you to their networking circle or being able to promote you into a new role. And it's really about taking action, right? So it's more than just, I'm going to give you advice, I'm going to give you coaching. It's now I'm taking my commitment to the next level and I'm putting my brand and my position and my name behind you so that you can succeed.
I think until I read your book, I didn't quite get the difference.
Yeah.
And so I think it's helpful to kind of underline how, we should look at mentorship and sponsorship. And I'm curious from the audience, how many of you in this room feel like you've had a mentor? Okay, quite a large group. And how many of you feel that you've had a sponsor? That's a smaller number. So that's indicative of a problem. We have a lot of women of color, a lot of people of color in the room. So, Jamie, one of the things that you state is that women of color are oversteered towards mentorship over sponsorship. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, when I was reflecting on a lot of things in writing the book and talking to my peers and others that have been successful, a lot of times for women of color, the first thing people tell you is you need to get a mentor, right? Because there aren't a lot of women of color in senior leadership. And clearly, if you have aspirations of getting to senior levels, you want someone to mentor you and tell you how to do that in a successful way. But when it comes to sponsorship, right, when someone is going to, if I'm, let's say, me and Tara used to be, we worked together and Tara is looking for sponsorship and we've been mentoring each other, or I've been mentoring her. And now she's asking me to nominate her for like a high visibility committee in my organization, right? That's a little bit of a risky proposition if Tara, for some reason, doesn't pan out. And I'm not saying that you would. I think you'd be fantastic. So
I think
that,
I would pan out.
but if something goes wrong in that experience for Tara, then there could be blowback on me, right? And so there's this natural reluctance of executives to sponsor a lot of people because they want to have that trust that you're going to succeed. And they want to make sure that if they do put their name behind you, that you will do well, and then it will reflect, positively on them. For women of color, first of all, I feel that relationships, I think, from senior leadership with women of color are lacking. There are not a lot of senior leaders that really intentionally go out and develop relationships with women of color. And the sponsorship relationship really is predicated on trust and making sure that there's a trusting relationship. So a lot of times, the comfort level for executives is to say, you should go find a mentor, right? Because again, it's a less risky relationship. And I think a lot of times people also think that mentorship is going to solve the problem. They don't, first of all, a lot of executives in their careers have never even heard of sponsorship, really. The origin of sponsorship really started with the Good Old Boys Network, if you've heard of that, right? That's really where it started, and it kind of flourished from there. So I feel like women of color are often told to find mentors because, again, it seems like an easier way to give them access, but they're really not providing the right visibility and the right relationship that they're needed.
I want to delve a little bit into the problems that women of color face in advancing their careers. In the first chapter of the book, you go into this in some detail, and we're introduced immediately to one of your mentees who texted you allegedly on October 17, 2019. I'm
Yes.
a lawyer. And she's described as an Indian American woman of color. And you describe a painful conversation that you had with her, where she exclaims, and I take this directly from the book, "I can't take this anymore. I need to find a new job where I feel valued, where my brain is valued." Admittedly, in reading this, I could not help but feel her pain as a fellow Indian American woman. But in this context of this discussion, you described an emotional tax or burden that women of color face. Can you describe what this emotional tax is and how it affects women of color disproportionately?
Right. Well, I remember that conversation very vividly because she is certainly not just a high potential, but will be an amazing senior executive once she gets the right opportunity. So when we talk about the emotional tax, first of all, women of color, when you come into the professional realm, there are some thoughts that women of color have to not be their authentic selves at work, right? So you can't bring your whole self to work. You have to code switch. You have to put on a facade, and you're not able to bring all of those experiences with you into the office because you might be labeled as, for Black women, it's being angry. There's so many different labels that can be put on you just for being who you are that I think other populations don't even think about, right? They just come to work and they're themselves and they're valued. In this instance, my mentee had been working with the team for a long time. She did a lot of work in the value-based care space, and her ideas, while in the moment weren't received, her senior leadership were presenting those ideas as if they were their own. And she found out about it, and she was extremely exhausted because these were her unique and novel ideas that she was bringing to the table that she felt no one was really valuing, and yet others were really benefiting from. So there's this emotional tax of having to come to work knowing that you can't really be your authentic self. You have to be a different version of yourself in order to make others feel comfortable, in order to get ahead in your career. And that can be taxing and exhausting. And I'm looking out into the audience and I see a few women nodding their heads. So you must experience it on some level yourselves, right? And you bring that home with you, right? So you have like an exhausting day at work where you're trying to just get through the day. And then you bring all of that stress home with you, and it can just be very emotional and draining. And so when I talk about the emotional tax, it's that whole concept of not being able to be your authentic self for fear of being labeled or judged in a lot of ways.
A question for the audience, can we get a kind of a poll? How many of you feel that you've had to in the past shelter your emotions in fear of whatever the perceptions of the audience that you're facing is in the past?
Oh,
Every
wow.
single person in this room. Maybe not some, but it looks like it. If you haven't, I'm kind of surprised, but we'll talk about that later. Delving into this emotional tax and other issues and problems that women of color face, you provide an example of Anne. Okay, and Anne is identified in your book as an African-American woman. She's a known thought leader in healthcare, kind of like you, seems to have done all the right things for all intents and purposes, went to the golf outings, did the coffee breaks, did everything you would think of. And she should have been considered as someone who's really prepared to be an equity partner at her global consulting firm.
That's right.
But then she learns, and this is what we learn in the book, that she will not be getting that promotion because she did not have the support of her partnership team.
Yeah.
You conclude that her dream was killed, because of a lack of sponsorship. Can you explain why?
Yeah. Well, first of all, making it to, and this was a consulting firm, but making it to an equity partner in any firm is not easy. I'm sure most people in this room would agree. It requires a lot of effort, a lot of personal sacrifice, a lot of growth on your own, and a lot of people who want to support you and see you as part of that partnership. And so she spent a lot of time doing excellent client work. The clients absolutely loved her. She was always counted on to deliver important projects, but she didn't have the relationships and the exposure to many of the partners that were going to be casting their vote. So when it came time for her to go up, and again, she thought she had checked all the boxes, she had all the metrics, she had client testimonials, people loved her that worked on her team. She realized that there were partners in the room that felt intimidated by her and did not want to vote for her that year. And it was soul crushing because she had to make, she was a working woman, she had a family, she made a lot of sacrifices on behalf of making that, that goal. And that's why I talk about sponsorship so much. It's about having the people in the room when it's time to say, Tara deserves, and you're already a partner, but Tara deserves to be partner at this firm. And I'm willing to stand up and say that and get others to also buy into that. When you don't have that, it doesn't matter how hard you work. It doesn't matter how many client testimonials you have. You have to have people with influence and the ability to make and open doors for you to advocate and support you. And so that was a perfect example of someone who, again, thought that they were doing all the right things. And women of color always think they're doing the right things, and we all do the right things, right? But it's that nuance of making sure that you have those relationships and the people who are willing to sponsor you and put you forward.
In the second chapter of the book, you mention a day of reckoning, and the date is January 11th, 2021. And when I saw that date, I thought it was about the prior week's assault on the nation's capital, but apparently for you, it was a CNN headline. Okay, what was that headline, and why did it make your head spin?
Well, first of all, I will say that the whole insurrection, which is what we're talking about, that definitely made my head spin. That was all over the news. But earlier that day, so I have a little text chain with a bunch of women executives, and we talk about a lot of different things. And on my phone pops up that I want to say it was more than 600,000 women had left the workforce in December 2020, just a month before. And I was completely floored because that is going to set back the progress of women advancing in the workplace by 10 years. Just from that 1 month of women leaving the workforce. And if you can remember, you can recall in 2020, when the pandemic happened, a lot of women were trying to balance now being at home, their spouses are at home, their kids are at home, and working a full-time job, taking care of the kids. And a lot of times their partner was not, doing their duties, right? So it became unbearable to try to manage all of that. and taking the conscious decision to step away from the workforce. And so I couldn't fathom 600,000 women leaving the workforce in 1 month because they simply could not make the whole work-life balance work given the pandemic.
Yeah, and you next discussed in the same chapter a number of alarming data points, suggesting that women of color were losing ground at every step during the pandemic across all industries. And can you give us a flavor of what that data ultimately led you to do?
Yeah. Well, in addition to obviously women leaving the workforce, there was a lot of, again, inequity around just, first of all, COVID outcomes for women of color. It was affecting people of color, women of color at higher rates. So, again, dying at higher rates than other populations. Already, women of color were struggling to make it to the C-suite, and yet women of color made up the largest portion of women who were leaving the workforce, right? So all the gains that had happened over the past 10 years were almost evaporated overnight because there were so many women who opted out of having a career because they couldn't figure out how to make this work. And that was really the catalyst of me wanting to really put the onus on not, let's just create a program, let's create an initiative to, help retain women, putting the responsibility on senior executive leadership to make sure that we are absolutely advocating for and sponsoring women of color and keeping them in the workforce was absolutely critical. And that's one of the reasons why I read the book and also made my own commitment to sponsor, because we can't regress in a way that, evaporates progress that we've been meaningfully making for like years.
Yeah, and the rest of the book kind of walks through a process of moving forward together.
Yeah.
Right. And you posit in the title of the third chapter that it's not a pipeline issue.
Mhm.
And the impetus for this conclusion is a conversation, I believe, that you had with a senior leader about the pipeline. She didn't know which Black women were in the pipeline for the next promotions.
Mhm.
That was the statement she was made. And you had a very negative reaction
Yes, I did.
to a comment. Why?
Um, I so I put a lot of responsibility on senior leaders to know the workforce, period. And I didn't feel like it was acceptable for a senior leader to say, I don't know how many, whatever population it was, but how many Black women are in the pipeline. Considering that there weren't that many of Black women in the organization, right? You should know who your rising stars are, who's next on deck. You should be doing that succession planning. You should be thinking about who you want to elevate. And the fact that this person, who is well respected in the organization, couldn't name 5 Black women that they would put in the role next, or just 5 women even, was just so disheartening. And it made me angry because that same person would talk about how we needed to diversify senior leadership. I mean, it starts with you. You need to understand what talent you have, and you need to support that talent.
We always hear this term pipeline, whether you're at a law firm in the context of this firm that we're currently at, or other firms that deal with this, or in-house or in government. There's always a discussion of a pipeline, and a pipeline is talent, essentially, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But you know that the pipeline is leaky,
Mhm.
right? And what do you mean that it's a leaky pipeline?
Well, there's a lot of effort put into what I call talent acquisition, which is getting talent in the door, right? A lot of marketing, a lot of dollars go into recruitment. And people come in the door, and for a variety of reasons, they leave after they get to a certain level. Usually it's at the manager level or just about right before they get to an executive level in a corporate setting. And so when we talk about the leaky pipeline, it's the notion that organizations spend a lot of time and effort on recruiting talent, but not retaining them. And they don't look at the data to understand why people are leaving. And then if they do look at the data and they see why people are leaving, they try to use a band-aid like a program to think that people will stay if they're engaged in that way. And they don't look at the root cause and figure out that people are leaving because they're not getting advancement. And there's no program that's going to solve that. It requires effort on the part of leadership to create opportunities for people to want to stay.
Why isn't increasing the pipeline necessarily the answer in that situation.
Yeah.
If there's more people in, there may be less people coming out, or is the pipeline continuing to leak at the same rate that you bring them in?
I think that's exactly that point. It's continuing to leak. And if you put too many people in the pipeline, you create disenchantment when people aren't advancing, right? You've got a lot of, at the, entry level to mid level, if you have a lot of talent there, and then you look at your senior leadership and it's not diverse at all, people see, hey, there's no way for me to be successful in this organization. And it breeds that disenchantment and that worry that if I spend more time in this company, I'm going to lose ground in my own career because I'm just not going to have opportunities to advance.
You talk about reframing the leaky pipeline.
Mhm.
How do you reframe that? And what do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, and I think Priya had mentioned this in the opening comments, is that there's always the talk about the pipeline, right? We need a pipeline to talent. And what leaders don't realize is that number one, you have the talent in your organization today. You don't need to necessarily go out and find new talent. You've got the talent already there, right? So it's not about not having a pipeline. You can create a pipeline today. If you looked at your talent today, you could identify the individuals that you think are going to be rising leaders or invest in those that are already in your organization. If you invest in sponsorship, that's where you actually see the outcomes, where you see executives that say, you know what, I'm going to sponsor one person that doesn't look like me. And the multiplier effect that happens when every single executive decides to make that commitment. And it puts their skin in the game, right? Because now they have a responsibility and an accountability to see the outcome rather than expecting HR or your DEI team to fix it, right? Because a lot of organizations, especially over the last 3 years, have hired chief diversity officers thinking that they're going to solve all their diversity problems. And while chief diversity officers are absolutely critical to organizations, there's only so much that person and that team can do. It really requires executives to step up their game.
Thank you. One of the most interesting aspects, and I talked about this kind of in our prep sessions, that I learned from your book stems from your discussion with the business resource group for Black women at Atrium Health named We Excel. What was this We Excel group, for those who have not read the book?
Yeah.
And let's start with that first. What
Yes.
was We Excel?
So there had been several years prior that the organization had invested in business resource groups for different populations. There was one for veterans, there was one for LGBTQ, there was, a lot of different populations that started to develop these internal groups. But there was not one for Black women. It was always an open question because there were a few Black women in senior leadership. And when you looked at the demographics, there was a large population of Black women that worked at the organization. And so a group of women got together and decided to put together a business case for a business resource group for Black women called We Excel. And it was really an important milestone in the journey on diversity for Atrium at the time because there was such enormous support at that time to create this group from leadership all the way down. But it transitioned into almost a fearful thing for women to be associated with this business resource group. There was a feeling brewing with certain senior leaders that the Black women who were part of this group were trying to quote unquote mobilize, right? And start to push an agenda, right? And they started to highlight, the demographics or the lack of women of color in leadership. They started to highlight some of the gaps that existed. And so I remember we were trying to prepare for a presentation to senior leadership, and we asked everyone to put together like a little slide on themselves. It was like their picture and their title and, where they went to school and what, just more about them. And I got a couple of calls unexpectedly from a couple women in the group, and they said, well, what are these slides going to be used for? And I said, oh, it's just, information. People want to get to know the group. They want to develop a relationship with you. And they said, well, I don't want to create a slide. I don't want to participate. And I remember asking them, why don't you want to participate in this important initiative? And they said, well, number one, I'm up for promotion this year. And if my boss, who is white, finds out that I'm somehow associated with this group, that could jeopardize my promotion. And it was such a shocking response, right? Because it was supposed to be a positive thing that we were creating this business resource group. But there was still this fear about being associated with this, really important business resource group because the perception was that we were trying to advance an agenda. And so it became almost a turning point in understanding that there's still a long way to go on that journey.
Yeah, and you mentioned this power dynamic
Mhm.
in sponsorship. Can you explain what that power dynamic is and how women of color struggle with that dynamic?
Yeah. Well, first of all, in sponsorship and even in mentorship, women of color tend to also be encouraged to find mentors and sponsors who look like them, right? So if you're a woman of color, finding another woman of color to be your mentor or your sponsor. What people don't realize is that there is a power dynamic in sponsorship where the data suggests, I think it was a study done by PayScale, that if obviously I'm a Black woman, if I have a white male sponsoring me, I am 5 times more likely to get a promotion, 6 times more likely to get a pay raise, right? And so navigating that and understanding that finding a sponsor or mentor that doesn't look like me, developing those relationships is absolutely critical. And part of it is accepting the fact that there is this power dynamic, that there are people who don't look like you that have and hold power in your organization. And accepting that and trying to find ways to develop the right relationships so that you can achieve your career goals is critical.
Well, let's talk about what it takes to be a good sponsor.
Mhm.
In chapter 6, you laid out a manifesto.
Mhm.
And in the manifesto, you identify 4 core principles of sponsorship: believe in potential, be generous, take risks, sponsor diverse talent. How did you drill down on those 4 core principles?
Yeah. Well, I reflected on the sponsors who had been very successful, had been very open about their sponsorship in my career and with others. And there were these commonalities, these common threads across the different sponsors and what they did and what they believed. And the 4 traits or the 4 kind of principles of that manifesto really embody, if you're going to sponsor talent, if you're really going to do it in a genuine way, you have to foundationally believe in those 4 things, right? You have to be generous. You can't be the type of person that expects, if I'm going to sponsor Priya, I expect her to like return it in spades and do all these things for me. It has to be unconditional. It has to be because I believe in Priya and I think that she's going to be really successful. You have to believe in sponsoring diverse talent, not always finding proteges that look like you, right? You have to believe in someone's potential. A lot of times, the reason why sponsors are reluctant is because they expect you to have achieved all of these amazing things in your career, and they don't think about the fact that you have potential in the future, right? So thinking about, maybe not today, but in the next 5 to 10 years, my protege is going to do amazing things, and I'm willing to place a bet today that that person is going to succeed. So there are these common threads across the sponsors that I had met that were successful, that had a followership, that could point to proteges that they've helped to develop. And those were the 4.
For the people in the room, in the next chapter, you discuss the 5 C's of being a great career sponsor.
Mhm.
If I wanted to be a good career or great career sponsor, what are those 5 C's and how can I equip myself to be a good sponsor?
Right. So the 5 C's that are really critical for being a great sponsor. Number 1, and I think it's probably the most important, is a great sponsor has to be courageous. They have to be willing to, when they're in the room and it's, the CEO and the board sitting around or whatever senior team sitting around, and they're asking, who is next? Who is the person that you want to put on this high visibility project? They are willing to stand up and say your name. So they're not afraid to give their opinion. They're not afraid to really support you. The second C is that they have to be committed, right? Sponsorship is not a one-time transaction. And there are many times where I have decided to support proteges, and maybe not every time was successful, right? Maybe I nominated someone for a speaking engagement and they didn't get it, right? If I wasn't committed to that person, I might say, I'm done, I'm not going to sponsor you again. Instead, if you're committed to that person, you keep trying and hopefully something will stick. The third C is that they have to be connected. They have to have networks that are wide or deep. They have to have people in their network that believe in them and that believe and trust your judgment. The fourth C is that they have to be candid with you. And I talk about sponsor readiness in my book because not everyone is ready for sponsorship, right? You have to do the work on yourself. You have to have proven that you are valuable and developed your own brand before others will be attracted to that brand. So a great sponsor will be candid about, your readiness for their sponsorship as well. And then the fifth C is that they have to have capital, right? They have to have the social and political capital to get others to buy into their sponsorship of you.
For those in the audience who might be looking for a sponsor, possibly even me, can you explain some tips on how to obtain the right sponsor?
Yeah.
Provide some.
Well, first of all, obtaining a sponsor is not the same as obtaining a mentor. I saw a lot of hands go up earlier about having a mentor in your career. And more than likely, either you went through a formal mentorship program or maybe informally you approached a leader and said, I really want to learn from you and let's develop this mentoring relationship. But sponsorship, because it requires trust and because it's not a transactional relationship, it tends to develop organically. And so what I tell people is when you're looking for sponsorship, be curious and obviously get to know the person that you want to have sponsor you. But think about the specific actions that you want from that sponsor and find a way to introduce them to your career goals and how that action can be helpful. So for example, let's say you're the type of person that really wants to sit on a board of directors. That's something that's in your career plan. It's something that you've been talking about and you've identified a sponsor that can really help you with that. First of all, take the time, develop that relationship, but then sharing your career goals and saying, you know what, I've always wanted to sit on a board of directors. I know that you sit on one yourself. Would you be willing to introduce me to some of your board members or someone in your network that's looking for a board member? Try to make it a way for them to be willing to help you that's not high risk, but doesn't feel transactional. So you don't necessarily go up to someone and say, will you be my sponsor, right? Because that never works. But it's more about what are the specific things in your career that you want to achieve and what actions do you want that sponsor to take for you?
You mentioned being sponsor ready and how to make not everyone is sponsor ready. How does one equip themselves to become sponsor ready?
Yeah, I think the main thing around being sponsor ready is having a very attractable brand. People have to be able to find you in your organization. They need to know what your value proposition is. What can they come to you for, right? And if you haven't worked on your individual professional brand, it can be extremely difficult for leaders to want to spend time with you. So if you have a specific niche, making sure that you are delivering on that and that others in the organization know that you're delivering on that. So working on your personal and professional brand is absolutely key. And the only other thing that I would add to that is, when it comes to sponsor readiness, it takes time to develop those relationships. So don't expect immediate sort of attraction of sponsors. It takes investment of yourself and it takes investment of that sponsor to you. So take the time to really think about your career goals, think about the individuals who have those 5 traits of being a great sponsor and finding that pairing is absolutely critical.
Thank you, Jamie. I think we have to move to the Q&A section. I'll first open it up to the people in the room. Anyone brave enough to ask a question? Oh, yeah, okay.
Yes.
Ann, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you? Yeah, there's a fancy button.
Hi, I know I came in late, but I was listening on Zoom and this is so helpful. I actually have a couple questions, but I'll ask this one first. I have a very good friend who's a woman of color at a big law firm who was assigned a sponsor. I think post George Floyd's murder, as a firm initiative. And it's worked great for her because her sponsor is like the perfect sponsor, has so much capital, has expended for her. But I was so surprised to hear that they had like an assigned sponsorship program. I mean, what are your thoughts about that? Because does that even really work?
It can. So sponsorship programs can absolutely work, but it requires deliberate selection of the right sponsors, right? People that want to do that work and are enriched by sponsoring others is absolutely critical. The other thing is that it has to be tied to outcomes. And I think where mentorship programs can fall flat is that there isn't a specific ask or outcome that comes out of a mentoring program outside of you meeting with your mentor on a regular basis and learning. With sponsorship, one of the questions I ask executives is, what sponsorship actions did you take for your protege? Like, what did you actually do? What action did you take on their behalf? And if they can't give me an answer, in my opinion, you're not a sponsor, right? You have to, the sponsorship requires you to do something important and different in that person's life. So it's not just about we're getting together for coffee and we're talking about your trials and tribulations and, I'm helping you, I'm giving you a forum to vent. It's you are taking an action for that person.
Yeah, I love it. So it sounds like the sponsor is accountable in that relationship.
Absolutely. In mentoring relationships, it's all about the mentee, right? They tell you you're driving the relationship, you're setting the agenda. For sponsors, it's really incumbent upon the sponsor to now be in the driver's seat.
Okay, hold on one second. We have 100 people who are on the Zoom, and we do have one question from the Zoom, which I'll get to in a second. But if there are other folks on the Zoom, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. So we'll take one more from the room, and then we'll go to the Zoom questions.
First of all, I want to thank you very much for this really robust discussion. But I would ask, do you ever find sponsors who select their sponsorees, so to speak? In the interest of full disclosure, I'm a justice on the Illinois Supreme Court, and I came today because I wanted to hear, I heard about your book and I wanted to see or hear about some of the contents that I think would be helpful to me. What I've done in the past is identify people that I wanted to sponsor. Have you found that to be something that's helpful?
So first of all, I think that that's fantastic that you're being thoughtful and thinking about individuals that you want to sponsor. My biggest caution, and I think the reason why I titled the book Inclusive Sponsorship, is that historically, people sponsor those that look and feel like them, and they become victim to similarity bias. And I remember in my career where senior leaders were, again, finding people that went to the same college, that grew up in the same hometown, went to the same church, had the same family background. And what that does is that closes the aperture for diverse populations to get access to sponsors. So I always encourage, especially if you're in a position to sponsor, when you're selecting people to sponsor, be thoughtful about who doesn't normally get access to sponsors.
Absolutely.
And develop those relationships and create opportunities for them as well. Otherwise, you're going to see the same people getting the same opportunities over and over again because of the similarity bias that is inherent in traditional sponsorship. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much.
The first question from the Zoom, and we now have two. So we'll take
Ooh, all right.
But the first question is, do you find that women of color do not want to sponsor other women of color as there may be
Ooh.
only one seat at the table for a woman of color?
That's the pie
Ooh.
question.
Oh, yeah.
Increasing the pie?
Increasing the pie. So there is an author that talked to, and again, it hits really close to home, that talks about this notion of the queen bee syndrome, if you've ever heard of that term, which is, again, women committing crimes against other women because there's only so many seats at the table, and you have proximity to men, and so you don't want to create additional opportunities for other women to get the same opportunities. You want it for yourself because you want to be the one and the only. I have found in my experience that there absolutely are situations where the same has happened for women of color, where you feel like the seats are limited and there's only so much space. And so you're unwilling to sponsor other women of color because of that. The other thing that I also see is women of color reluctant to sponsor other women of color because of the perception that you're trying to advance women of color, right? And again, these are all things that women of color have to think about versus other populations, right? And I think that the most important thing is, I don't care what table you're at, how little or few seats there are, get a bigger table. Create a bigger table for yourself if you're in that position. So this whole scarcity mindset is what's creating this competition among women of color, and it has to stop. You have to believe that there are infinite opportunities for women of color. I always say, if you believe that, there are infinite number of stars in the sky, why would you not want every single woman to be her own star, right? So creating that opportunity is really important.
If you go on a lunch with a senior who you think could potentially become a sponsor in the long term, what kind of conversational topics would you recommend?
Well, first of all, I'm a big fan of just being naturally curious, right? So there's a reason why you selected that senior to take to lunch. Get to know their career. How did they get there? Get to know what they specialize in, how you can be helpful to them. Treat it as developing a relationship, because that's where trust starts, right? And if you stop thinking about it being, oh, I need to somehow make them my sponsor, and you genuinely develop the relationship, I can guarantee you the conversation around sponsorship becomes organic because they get to know you, you get to know them. It feels like there's a bond being formed, and then they feel invested in your relationship. They feel invested in seeing you succeed. So that's what I would say.
I got to follow up on that if that's all right. Jamie, one thing that we've heard is, how do you build this bond if you really don't have any commonalities, right? You don't really play golf. You don't really like sports. How do you bridge that gap? And what tips might you have for people to kind of bridge that gap when they're struggling with these issues?
Yeah. I love the golf example. I don't play golf either.
Right.
And I have a lot of people
Terrible at it.
that do play golf. So first of all, I think that there are absolutely other ways to bond with people, whether it's talking about your family, how you grew up. You'll be surprised sharing your personal life story and people finding commonalities in that. So again, making it more personal. The other thing is you can bond over work. You can commiserate over work, right? You can share your struggles over work and find that connection over the actual work that you do, even if you don't play golf, or I guess now it's pickleball. That's like a big thing. So don't think about it as, the traditional, we've got to have something common. We got to talk about sports. I mean, there are so many different common points that you can have with someone. Being a little bit vulnerable and sharing how you grew up and where you came from and what your values are is a great way for someone to find that connection with you.
I have more online questions, but does anyone in the room have a question?
All right, let's take an in-room question over here.
What do you say to people who might be apprehensive to putting structure around sponsorship programs?
And when you say putting structure around it, like making it like a formal program?
Yeah.
Okay. So there, just like with mentorship, you can have formal and informal programs. The same can be true for sponsorship. The benefit of having structure in a sponsorship program is the accountability, right? So it's because, sponsorship takes time to develop, but it also is an additional thing that you're doing from your day job, right? So if you're going to invest the time in sponsoring someone, it needs to be meaningful, but it also has to have an outcome. So if someone is really, or if the leadership team is really intent on believing in diversity, equity, inclusion, it's a value of your organization. You want to see better representation and leadership. That structure really holds executives accountable. And so that's what I would say. The structure brings some of that to the table versus making it informal. And then when people participate in informal sponsorship programs, they can get a little bit fatigued because there aren't any outcomes with it. So that's what I would say. It brings that accountability to the table.
Thanks for doing. I guess I can use the mic. No, thank you for doing this. I guess listening to this, full disclosure, I'm not a lawyer, but I feel like one of the biggest barriers to sponsorship is reputation risk. And like I invest in startups, and if someone sends me like startups that aren't that great, like over time, like I just devalue their opinion. How do you think, what do you think we can put in place to like lower that reputation risk when it comes to sponsorship?
I think it's an excellent question. And again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier about the risk that comes a lot of times, perceived or real, with sponsorship. Number one, again, I will say this until I'm blue in the face. A good sponsor relationship is based on trust, right? Trust that you know the person that you're sponsoring. So I don't recommend you sponsoring someone that you don't know, right? You absolutely have to know them. You have to know their background. You have to know what they bring to the table, right? The other thing you have to accept, I think, in sponsorship is that sometimes you will fail. Sometimes that relationship will not pan out. You have to have the courage to continue to want to sponsor, whether that person or other people. But I think that inherently with sponsorship, and this goes back to the reputational risk, I have not met a single executive that has sponsored someone that didn't work out and it ruined their career. It might be temporary. It might be, maybe someone doesn't, won't look at you the same initially if you sponsor someone that doesn't work out. But by and large, people will appreciate the fact that you're sponsoring at all, right? That you're stepping up into your leadership. So that fear around what happens with my reputational risk? I mean, I work in talent acquisition, working with C-suite leaders. Again, I have yet to meet a single C-suite executive that has sponsored someone, it didn't work out, and they had problems in their career after that. Every single executive that I know didn't get to that level without sponsorship themselves. So it's an absolutely intrinsic and important value to have as a leader.
Well, and kind of following up on that, if they already have the political capital, how much harm could there actually be?
Exactly. Yeah. If you have the political capital, it's very difficult for and the right judgment. You yourself have to have good judgment as well. But if you have the political capital, it's very difficult to completely ruin your career over someone that you sponsor.
This has been amazing. So thank you so much for having us and sharing all your insight. You guys have talked a lot about risk, and sitting on the other side of the table, if you want to be sponsored, what are things that you can do so that you are or perceived as less risky? What are things that you can do to encourage someone to change over from just being a mentor to a sponsor?
And can I just say, we have a similar question from
Okay.
the chat on Zoom, in that it's just worded slightly different, which is, what are some of the ways someone could be useful to a sponsor so that they're willing to take on the risk?
Number one, doing excellent work, letting your work speak for itself, right? Being excellent at your craft, being known for what you do. And when I talked earlier about having a brand, that is one of the easiest ways to de-risk someone wanting to sponsor you. If you are known in your company, in your industry for being excellent, then the apprehension around them wanting to put their name behind you is completely lowered. So I would say doing, table stakes, doing excellent work and having an excellent brand. I also think it's okay, and I know it's been a dirty word, self-promotion, right? I think a lot of times, especially women of color, are told that self-promotion is a bad thing. I am very bullish on self-promotion. If you are getting opportunities, if you are being asked for your thought leadership, share that with your sponsor. Those are all important things for them to know, because then that helps them be able to tell your story as well. A sponsor is really your ambassador, right? And if you want someone to be out there advocating for you, they need to know about all the fantastic things that you're doing so that they can also help attract others to want to sponsor you. So having a brand, doing excellent work, and then finding a way to elegantly self-promote, I think is absolutely critical.
Hi, thank you again, and Saba, thanks for bringing all of us together. There's really strong groups in here. I was really intrigued by your comments about this idea of almost imagined scarcity. And I was hoping you could provide some examples, maybe from your experiences, from your research, of how we combat that. How do we make more space? How do we make other tables?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it requires a mindset shift. I think, honestly, corporate America has created the infrastructure for this sort of behavior to breed because of the competition that happens with women, with men, within populations where we can only have so many people in the room, right? We can only have so many people at the table. I think as a leader, and I've seen leaders do this very well, When you create your own followership, you can create your own table, right? And when people see you being an authentic leader, an inclusive leader, they're also attracted to you. And when you have that political capital as a sponsor, you absolutely can create your own networks, your own tables, and have access to better opportunities. So part of it is, as a leader, shifting your focus on scarcity to abundance and creating opportunities for people by expanding your networks and being unconditional and generous with that. The other thing is, when you see it happening, when you see the scarcity mindset happening, telling stories of where you've seen abundance happening and sharing those stories also helps to create a different mindset. And I'm a big proponent of sharing stories of sponsorship, sharing stories of other leaders who have sponsored rising talent and those successes. And when you tell those stories, it becomes infectious. So again, shifting that mindset and encouraging others to, if you're not getting the opportunities that you think you should, creating your own space for success. Absolutely.
I want to hear if there's more questions, but I actually have a question.
Okay.
So sometimes you might be in an organization where there isn't someone to sponsor you, or you can't find a sponsor, or you had a sponsor, but the sponsor leaves the organization. Are there certain signs that you can offer that it's the right time to leave the organization and perhaps go to another organization?
Well, I think that's first of all, it's a great question. And to start off the answer, number one, you should never just have one sponsor. You should have multiple, whether it's in your organization or in your industry. And I would almost say it's almost better to have multiple sponsors in your industry because of this whole notion of people moving around and getting opportunities and leaving, right? I've known several people that have put all their eggs in one basket. There was this one partner that they were going to just follow in their career, and that partner decides to leave and go to another firm, and then they're like, oh my gosh, what does that mean for me? So it requires you to think about having, de-risking by having multiple sponsors. Back to the warning signs. If you have a sponsor that is not actively engaging and sponsoring you, if they're not taking actions on your behalf, it is, number one, absolutely okay to sever that relationship. Clearly that relationship is not bearing fruit for you, right? It's not healthy to be in a relationship where it feels one-sided and it's not, mutual. But if you look around your organization and you don't have a single person that can talk intelligently about what you do to others, that is talking about you in rooms that you don't have access to, the prospect of you really succeeding there is fairly low. And coming up with an exit strategy becomes absolutely important, right? You absolutely have to have someone in your organization, that's willing to sponsor you, but also knows you for you to succeed. And that goes back to that conversation about the person that went up for partnership and found out at the 11th hour that she had no one in her corner. And then that left her in a really big pickle. So that's what I would say.
Questions? Time for one or two more.
I'll ask a question, just to make sure that we're here. This discussion is partially about, being in a legal environment, How can we, I'm the leader of a bar association. There's many other leaders of bar associations present here. How can we, as a group, ensure that there is an inclusive sponsorship culture? What can we do to do that?
Well, I think associations are really important to create the networking opportunities for people to find sponsors outside of their firm, right? So the fact that there are many people in this room that are part of associations is absolutely critical. And I talk in my book about how networking is really the foundation for sponsorship and being able to introduce yourself to others. So associations that create forums, opportunities for people to connect is really critical to creating that sponsorship culture. I also think encouraging your senior most leaders of your association to talk about people that they've sponsored, to use their associations to find talent to sponsor that might not have that opportunity in their own firm is absolutely important. And instilling those principles and encouraging people to participate and engage in that way. The other thing I talk about in my book is peer sponsorship. A lot of times people think you have to be the senior-most person in your organization to sponsor. But the truth is, you just have to be a person that's got political capital, and that could be a peer, right? So not overlooking people at your level that can also be sponsors for you. And a lot of times you find them in associations and membership organizations too.
I was thinking about this after reading the book, actually, thinking about my own career. And I'm sure many of the people in this room are doing the same thing.
Mhm.
I'm definitely a little past mid-career at this point, just slightly. At least I hope so. And, thinking about who has sponsored me in my 19-year career at the same firm and who is currently sponsoring me, the individuals have changed.
Yeah.
And I find at my level of seniority, I'm more seeing peer sponsors than anyone senior.
Mhm.
And have you seen that develop in your career as well? There's more peer sponsors as opposed to senior members because you've already reached a certain career standpoint?
Absolutely. I think peer sponsorship is one of the most overlooked things. And I find that at your peer level, one would say that there's actually more competition. But I think in today's environment, there's a lot more support with your peers to want to see you succeed versus someone who's been in their career 30 years, probably thinking about retiring, has no time to really invest in mentorship or sponsorship or anything. They're thinking about their yacht that they're going to buy when they retire. They're just not in the right mindset versus a peer who is thinking to themselves, the multiplier effect. If I help you, you're going to be inspired to help someone else, and it becomes, again, contagious, right? So I think I've seen, more of the peer mentorship, peer sponsorship really evolving and growing over time because of that desire to want to be helpful.
Thank you.
And we have a few more questions from online.
Okay.
Do you find that after the Me Too movement that men are not willing to sponsor women?
Ooh, that's a good question. If I'm being honest, I feel like there's more reluctance. There's more hesitation. On average, that's not necessarily based on quantifiable data, but anecdotally, there has been more of a reluctance for men to want to sponsor women for a variety of reasons. I think Me Too is one of those things. And the way to really combat that is to remind leadership that the only way you can really achieve the business outcomes that you want is by having diversity in leadership, right? There's so many studies that have talked about how diversity in leadership directly hits the bottom line of your organization. And a lot of companies are now being held accountable for what their leadership teams look like, right? I think someone was talking about investing in startups. I know someone who works in VC and also private equity. And one of the criteria that they look at is the leadership team of that startup. And they want to know, if you say that you're about DE&I, what is the makeup of your leadership team? And that becomes criteria to decide if I'm going to invest, right? So companies are being held very much accountable for that. But yes, to answer the question, there is a little bit more of a reluctance to doing that, but you have to continue the conversation about why diversity in leadership is essential to advance the business.
So Jamie, in addition to your book, you've written a number of articles
Yes.
for Forbes and others. And one of them that always stuck with me is where you talk about different ways that individuals can sponsor each other,
Mhm.
even if they're not within the same organization. And building on Tara's question, given that we are all part of bar associations for the most part in this room, can you run through some of those examples of how we can be sponsoring each other as friends and as supporters of each other through the bar association?
Absolutely. So there are a couple that I love because they're not hugely risky, at least on the surface, and don't require a whole lot of effort. And it's a great way to practice sponsorship in a way that feels enriching. Number one, I'm on stage today because of the sponsorship of Priya. Who is one of my peer sponsors. And she nominated me and has nominated me for speaking engagements. And that's one of those things where, again, as someone who's coming up in the legal profession, and I don't know that much about law, but I imagine that lawyers specialize in different topics, right? And want to be known for their expertise in different topics. When you have opportunities to nominate people for, speaking engagements, That's so low risk to do, but such a big impact for someone to get visibility outside of their firm within their industry. Nominating people for board seats. The other thing, and I'm sure in the legal profession and in associations, there are a lot of awards and recognition programs out there for the work that you do. And finding some of your peers that are very deserving and submitting a nomination for them so that they can get recognition for their work. And again, these are low risk things. It's not requiring you to promote someone or really stick your neck out. It's really finding ways that are small acts of sponsorship that have a major impact. Those are just a few, but another one that again, when you're thinking about associations and networking, making warm introductions to people in your network, right? If you know someone that's a senior leader and you have a peer that would love to get to know that person, sending an email for a warm introduction and introducing them and talking about their value and why they should meet. These are all things that you can do without being the senior most person in your firm. But it's a way for you to start practicing those muscles and being able to step into your own leadership around
Becoming
that.
generous.
Becoming generous, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, well, we are at time. I see one question. Let's try to get to it.
First of all, thank you so much for being here. This is really helpful and enlightening. And my last question, or the one to wrap up the event, is what sponsorship was most fruitful for you? How or why? And what professional roles did you or the person you sponsored, the person that sponsored you, take?
Yes, and I will pull one from the book because it was really a catalyst. So I was working on a team where I was doing, like I said, amazing work, and I was working for a woman who was bullying me. She felt threatened by the work that I was doing. She was trying to get others at her level to also believe that I was not of value on the team. And every day was a struggle. And I talk about in the book that I would literally drive to work and sit in the parking lot and for 15 minutes, like have to say affirmations to myself because I'd have to deal with her the first moment I walk in, I'd have to deal with her. And I had a sponsor who had known of my work. I'd worked with her on another team. She happened to be the chief of staff of the organization. So she was number 2 to the CEO. And I remember calling her up after one particular day of being bullied. And I just asked her for my advice. I said, or for her advice, I said, how should I deal with this bully who literally every day was a challenge? The next day she picked up the phone, she called the CHRO. She identified a high visibility role for me in the company. At the time, they were expanding regionally and they needed someone to help with like post-merger integration. And within 36 hours, I got moved from that team and put in that role. 6 months later, I got promoted to my first executive role. She went and advocated for my promotion to the CEO. A year later, I had made Modern Healthcare's top rising leaders in healthcare. That was the most impactful sponsorship I'd ever had, right? Someone who saw my value, saw that I wasn't going to reach my potential in that situation, plucked me out of that situation, put me in another role and said, I believe in you. I know that you can do this role well. I rose to the challenge and did what I could do, and the rest was history. And that's the power of sponsorship, right? Giving someone and opening the doors for them so that they can succeed. So that's what I would say.
That's a really good closing, actually.
So,
Go ahead.
yeah, so I just want to say, Jamie and Tara, thank you so much for having this conversation today. Jamie, for writing the book, for sharing what's in the book, and sharing your personal experiences. I think it was helpful to the 100 folks on the Zoom and the almost 50 people that we have in the room. And thank you all for joining us, whether it was online or in person. If you are in person, we do have a reception now, and I encourage you to stay and network, get to know each other. Jamie and Tara will also be at the reception, so if you have further questions that you weren't able to ask, you can do that as well. And like I said, I'm going to pick 3 people to give copies of the books to, so I'll just come and find you.
Yeah, just as a reminder, the name of the book is Inclusive Sponsorship, A Bold Vision to Advance Women of Color in the Workplace.
Yep, and there's a postcard at each of your seats that has a QR code to Amazon if you want to buy it. It is a great book. You will not regret buying it, reading it, taking the points in there and using them in your day-to-day life. So thank you again. Oh, go ahead. No, we can do a group picture though. Yeah,
Oh my
Okay.
gosh.
Oh, and a selfie, okay.
let's do it.
High tech.
And
This is
Yaz,
wild.
you can end the Zoom portion of the
Yeah.
event.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll get one in a second.